And I'm just going to do the process of going on live, which probably take, or maybe I'll wait 1 more minute.
Right.
Sometimes it takes longer, then I'm like, oh, I'm late, but then just depends on the internet sometimes. How much? Oh yeah, we're 1:59, so I'll go live, but you'll know, and then I'll mute myself as well.
Then from that point, I can just sort of start whenever I like.
Yeah.
Kapai.
Paul PK live. So share to your page, Parakore. Kapai. So I'm just going to click this. So I'll be quiet. I'll go on mute after this, and it should show in your top corner that we're live as well.
Kia ora e te whānau Parakore. Kia ora e te ao pukimata. Nau mai haere mai ki tēnei kōrero, tēnei wānanga pāmu noke. Ko Paul Murray ahau, ko matua X-Man toku ingoa. Ko te Kaiārahi Parakore mō Waikato. Kei te mahi ahau ki ngā kura, ki te hapori hoki. Welcome everybody to this special Facebook Live broadcast from Parakore, talking all about worm farms and pamunoke. My name is Paul, and I'm a Kaiārahi here in the Waikato, working mostly in schools and in kindergartens and community organizations. Now, with Parakore, we set up composts all around the place. We encourage whānau and marae and schools and kura and kindies and anybody really to set up composts. And as we do that, and as I travel around and revisit some of these composts, I've noticed, you know, not issues so much, but things happening in people's composts, and I'm often giving some advice. So therefore, today, the top tips on how to keep your worm farm pumping, and hopefully you'll find this of help, some of the stuff we go through today. Now, we are recording this, so this could be used as a resource for later. You could go back and watch the video and go through some of the top tips. We've also got live, it's Facebook Live, so you can ask questions as we go through, and I have my technical assistant sending through some of your questions to me so I don't miss some of those. So feel free to ask questions as we go through. Well, let's get started. So here's what we're going to cover today. What to feed the worms, how to feed the worms. Those are two different things. Some common issues and solutions. How to harvest your liquid fertilizer that you get from a worm farm. How to harvest the worm castings or the compost, the actual soil that we're making. And as well, how to get started yourself and how to make your own worm farm. So let's begin. Number one, what to feed the worms. Now, compost in general, a broad general rule of what goes in the compost is if it's made from a plant, if it comes from a plant, if it is a plant, it can go in the compost. However, we need to refine that a little bit more when we start talking about, in particular, worm farms. So a starting point is that there are two different main components of what we're going to put into compost and put into worm farms. We have nitrogen and carbon. Now, you've probably heard those words before. Here's how we describe them. Nitrogen is ngā mea kakariki, is green stuff. Now, take note, look at that photo above the nitrogen. You can see a banana, yellow, that's nitrogen. Or a carrot, orange, that's nitrogen. Or beetroot, purple, that's also nitrogen. It doesn't necessarily mean green as in the color. It means green as in living or alive. It was recently a plant, it was still kind of alive. You've peeled it, cooked it, boiled it, chopped it, fried it, baked it. It was recently a plant, it was recently living. Green also meaning like green wood, like a twig on a living tree. If you bend it, it's not dry, hard, burnable. It's fresh and bendy and boingy and still alive, green. Wet, meaning not wet because it got rained on, but wet as in there is moisture, there is water inside the cells still of the peel. So you think of a banana peel, you think of the potato peelings, they're squishy, there's water in them, they're wet, they're not a dried out material, they still have moisture in them, and therefore fresh. Carbon is the opposite. So the color of dead stuff, as you can see in the picture above, is brown, and it's not wet, therefore the opposite of wet, it's dry. It's not fresh, it's dead. So it's the kind of stuff that you could probably put in a fire and burn. So it's that real carbon, woody, dry material. Having said that, what would you call this? Nitrogen or carbon? Have a look. Is it green, fresh, wet, squishy? Nitrogen, carbon? I wish I could see your comments as I was doing this, but correct. Nitrogen. Yep. What about this one? Nitrogen or carbon? You can see the difference there, can't you? Green, wet, fresh, dry, brown, dead. Carbon. Now we need both of these in the compost. So, and in worm farms as well. One of the main things I see going on in composts is that people add lots and lots of nitrogen, they forget to add the carbon. So around about, well, there's different ways of looking at it. It does depend on the size of your containment, the size of the compost, the shape and the way that it functions. Some would say 70% nitrogen, 30% carbon. I've heard of some as high as 50-50. There are some compost methods that would even take more carbon than nitrogen. So it's kind of knowing what your container is. But as a rule of thumb, the thing we have to remember today is that you need both. You need nitrogen and you need carbon. Here's some of the reasons why. So carbon is actually adding the matter to make the new soil. We are basically making new soil. The process of composting is making new soil. Which, you know, in a time and an age when we are taking from Papa Tuanuku, and we're taking her resources and we're taking what she offers us and gives us, compost is radical because it's one of the few actions we can do in our home environment where we are giving back to Papa Tuanuku. We're actually growing new soil. We're restoring Papa Tuanuku. We're making her healthy. And healthy soil creates healthy food. The more nutrients in the soil, the more nutrients are taken up into the plants. The more nutrients in the plants, the more nutrients in our tinana. So healthy soil equals healthy food equals healthy us. And looking after the worms, in fact, is looking after the soil, which looks after the food, which looks after us. So our very act of composting and worm farming is manakitanga, is kaitiakitanga. Of Papa Tuanuku and all her children and all the things that keep us living and healthy and alive. It's one of the best things we can do. So for worm farms, putting carbon in there, it actually does a whole bunch of jobs as well. It aerates. So too much nitrogen and it turns into muck. And it becomes boggy. So carbon helps keep space and movement and aeration and oxygen, and worms need oxygen. They cannot live in an anaerobic state. It also provides cover and habitat or bedding for the worms. They love living, you'll see, crawling through the paper and cardboard, but it also balances out the moisture level and most importantly, the pH levels. We're going to talk a bit about that. Worms don't like or don't thrive or don't even want to live in acidic conditions, and one of the techniques to balance out the pH in a compost that is too acidic where worms do not want to live is simply making sure you've got carbon in there, which can be just as easy as paper and cardboard. So an easy way of thinking of it is that nitrogen is the dinner for the worms and the carbon is the duvet. So you need your bedding and you need your kai. You need to have both. Number one thing I see happening the most is nitrogen, 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 and it ends up being sloppy, wet, mucky, smelly, and therefore acidic, and the worms aren't too happy about living there. We're going to cover some of those issues a little bit later on. Now, just as an extra tip, this was something I did this morning. I like also getting some real living carbon to add into my worm farms. So this is from a sort of pile of mulch, and as you can see, it's got wood chips and brown leaves and that sort of dying, decaying plant sort of mulchy matter, and that's going to be full of microorganisms and bacteria and lots of living stuff that are just going to infiltrate your compost and make it alive. It's more of a living carbon. Paper and cardboard are good, but they don't carry that bacteria. So I put both in. I put a nice sprinkle of that over top of my nitrogen, over top of my food scraps, to get both going. Provides the structure, provides the habitat, balances the moisture, balances the pH, carbon, nitrogen. So that's the first bit. Just a note on the carbon. You want it to be like the picture you saw a few back, that real woody, fibrous kind of carbon, not the shiny cardboard, not the glossy stuff. That's it takes longer to break down. It's like a smooth surface and the worms just can't get into it. So that rough brown paper, like egg cartons and, you know, that other kind of brown paper is the best to put in there. Now, carbon and nitrogen, we've covered the first thing. You need both of those. Now, within that, worms, as we said, do not thrive in acidic conditions. They like it alkaline. So acidic means they're not going to like it, and they're probably going to take off. You'll see lots of little lists about what to put in the worm farm and not, and people kind of get a bit confused by them, but I'm going to show you a few, and you'll see that it's the same theme going through. You'll start to see a pattern of why you would put these things and not those things. So citrus and acidic fruits right there, chili and spicy food. So the foods that are astringent, like onions and garlic and chili and spicy food, you wouldn't put that in there for the same reasons. And that could potentially either drive your worms away or even kill them if it's the wrong kind of stuff. Meat and seafood attracts a whole range of other creatures into your compost, such as maggots and flies and other things. So if you're opening your lid and you've got a whole bunch of flies and things coming out, my first question would be, what are you putting in your worm farm? So avoid meat, seafood. Also the bread is a big one. Bread, biscuits, pasta, rice, because the first thing that happens there is that they turn to mold, and the worms aren't interested in living in a mold environment. That's not what they're feeding on. They feed on the plant matter as it is in its process of breaking down. It doesn't want to be already broken down. It doesn't want to be rotten, and it doesn't want to be mold. So those things can go into compost. Yes, they're technically made from a plant, but in an enclosed environment where the worms are having to live within that habitat, those things can alter the environment, and it can make it unfavorable for them, which means they die, they take off, or yeah, they just diminish, and your worm farm won't be working as it should. Dog or cat poo obviously carry parasitic things and other bacteria that we do not want in our food systems. Well, enough said. So here's another list. Here you can see it once again. Most fruit and veggie scraps. So therefore, not lemons and citrus and acidic and onions, but most other fruit and veggie scraps. Those paper towels, they're great. Tea bags, coffee grounds, again, can be acidic. You can put coffee grounds in your worm farm, but I wouldn't be piling it up because that can turn it to that acidic state again. Some mixed in with other things, kaiārahi. Crushed eggshells are a really good strategy because they actually, I've learned, help balance out the pH. True fact. So if it is acidic, if you're finding your worm farm is acidic, dried up, crushed up eggshells, then added in and mixed through, help balance that pH. So you don't have to buy anything, you can use the food that you've got. Here's another list. Now this is on, if you have a hungry bin, lots of the schools that and kindies and community organizations I work in, I've set up these hungry bins. It's part of the thing we do at Parakore. This is just on their website. So again, if you're wondering if you're doing it right, there's a whole menu there of things you can find out about, and lots of these bits in this slide presentation today have just come straight off that website. Again, you can see most fruit and veggie scraps, but they don't like citrus, acidic fruit, so on. Pulp from the juicer is a really good idea. Cooked food, fine. Now, the reason you don't put oily food in there is that worms have a different kind of skin to us. Now, as humans, we have oily skin because we live in the in the sun and the wind, and so our oily skin keeps us from drying out. You know, fingerprints on the window, oily skin. Worms don't have oily skin. They're designed to live underground in the damp and the dark and the wet. Oily skin oils burn them. It's why we use gloves in the worm farm. It's why we don't put oily food as well. So if you're doing some sort of a fry up or a curry or things like that, don't put the spicy food, don't put the oily food in there. Just think plants. Right, and you can see a few notes down there about lawn clippings and, you know, all the rest. It just explains what you can do with those, and hopefully you can go back and have a look at this and look at some of this detail a little bit later. So at my house, I have a bit of a 2-bin system, therefore. It starts with that compost bucket inside, but I divide it up out here before I go and process the worm farm just to make it easier. So on the one side, I've got the bucket of things that I feed the worms with: fruit, veggies, coffee, tea, everything we've just said. Other side, well, citrus is a fruit, yes, but we've talked about that. Citrus, onion, garlic, bread, those things are the classics that worms aren't going to want. You can still compost them, just not in the worm farm. And then they go out here to my worm farm, is where it goes. So a couple of points here, just that you can put those foods in your worm farm. Some people say, oh, I just, you know, open the lid and biff it all in and away we go, and the worms just seem to, you know, do something. That's true. But the food that they don't like, the key point there is that they will avoid them. They won't eat them. They'll go around them. And so then that food does decay and it rots. It's not composting, it's rotting. Different kind of process. That becomes anaerobic. That becomes acidic. So it creates the conditions the worms don't like. We want to put food in there that the worms are going to process. And as you'll see, they process pretty quickly. So that's a reason why not to put those things in there. And the smaller and the softer the food, the easier it is for them to digest. We'll get to that in a second when we talk about how to feed the worms. So my strategy at home is I have 3 different compost systems you can see in the photo. In the far end, the green ones, you can see my 2 worm farms set up. That's where I put all those things. This big black one in the middle, that's my therma compost, or my hot compost. Now, it's not a worm farm. It's just using heat, air, water, and worms to some extent to break down the matter, but it's not an enclosed worm system, so the worms aren't trapped within that context or situation of you know, extreme stuff that they don't want. So everything I don't want to put in the worm farm, I put over here. So when I walk out with my buckets to the compost to do my composting job, this goes in the worm farm, this goes in the hot compost. Here's the stuff for the worms, here's the stuff for the other one. And I still treat it the same. You can see that there's carbon and nitrogen. I'm still layering it, but there's the cardboard that the worm farm wouldn't like. There's the citrus and the onion that the worm farms wouldn't like. So still composting, not putting it into landfill, of course. 2 different systems. And in the photo before, you can see my 3rd one, this little bucket in the front, which is bokashi. That's another story. That's another day. That's another one. And that's all about how you can deal with your meat and bread and dairy. So all those things can be composted, 3 different systems. Today, we're talking about worms. There we go. Now, how to feed the worms. So that was what to feed the worms: nitrogen, carbon, nothing acidic, and all that list. How to feed the worms. Also important, because this is another issue I see quite that we need to correct quite a lot in how people are doing their worm farms. So these are the most common mistakes that I see, or, you know, in the processing of worm farms. Number 1, too much food, too much, piled up. If it's piled up, the worms can't make their way through it. If they can't make their way through it, again, the food rots, which then becomes acidic, everything we've just talked about. Too big. There should be no whole pieces of anything going in there. Often food buckets, again, I work in schools, so I see school compost and I see entire whole apples and entire pieces of fruit and whole bananas. Well, a worm is that big and the apple and banana is this big. They can't eat it. And again, it will just rot, it will smell, it will attract flies, and it's too much. It's just too big for the worms to process. Too deep, you're piling it up too high. You know, it shouldn't be a mound. It shouldn't just be tipping a bucket into the worm farm and closing the lid. They can only process a very thin layer, which I'll tell you about in a second. And probably feeding, again, kind of like too much, too often. Therefore, this is what you should do. Now, that's how I fed my worm farm this week. So you can see what we're looking for here. We need smaller pieces. Now, different ways. Worm farm enthusiasts talk about blending it up, and that's great. The smaller the pieces, the easier it's going to be for the worms to process. This here says no bigger than 5 centimeters. Sometimes I say no bigger than your pinky, no bigger, longer, wider than your pinky. Small pieces. You know, don't always have to get everything into tiny pieces, but the smaller the pieces, the easier it will be for them to process and to turn that into compost, which is the ultimate goal. I've also heard people say no bigger than a golf ball. So an apple versus a golf ball. Small pieces. No deeper than, say, 5 centimeters deep. And you want to make a bed. If you're making your bed, you don't have a pile of blankets in the middle. You spread it out. Spread it out nice and thin. You want a layer, not a heap. Yep, small pieces, not too deep. Spread it out. Don't forget to add some fibrous carbon materials at the same time. So you can see in my photo there, I've got some really colorful nitrogen. You can also see the brown rough material that does all those things we've just said. Yep, and the last thing is give them a chance to eat it too. So you should see the food going down. A fully operating, well, not necessarily going down, but going away, a fully operating worm farm with heaps of worms in it and the right amount of food going into it, the food should nearly be disappearing. You know, when you come back, if you haven't fed them for a week or two and you come back, it should be soil nearly, not much left. I do work, as worm farms multiply and you get more worms, you can feed them more as the population of the worms increase and they can handle it. Worms are generally eating their body weight and size every day in the worm farm. Now, I can see, Anna, your question there, what happens if I have flies in there already? So it depends on what kind of flies. There's fruit flies, there's like, you know, other flies that would come towards meat and things like that. Depends on the flies. You could dig material out that you think is the offending item. Fruit flies can also be an indicator of your farm being acidic. So if you open it up and lots of little things come buzzing out, it's too acidic. So number one solution to that actually is to cover it with a carbon lid like this. So when I put my food in there, I always put a carbon cover on top. And that's really good for things like pizza boxes and dirty paper, dirty cardboard that can't go into recycling because it's paru, but you could put it in your worm farm. And so covering your food waste with carbon is one way to get rid of flies. It could be that mulchy stuff I showed you. It could be just paper and cardboard in general, or putting a cardboard lid on there. So that's one way to deal with flies. Another one is also adding lime. I've heard two trains of thought about garden lime. Some say that has chemicals in it, not to use the dolomite lime from garden centers, but getting a more pure sort of a phosphate lime ground up, perhaps from a garden center or something. You could do that. I add lime. I'm just using the regular lime. I put that in there, a sprinkle of that once every couple of months, something like that. And that also deals with the acidity levels. So flies are usually an indicator of something that shouldn't be in there, or possibly acidity. That answers that question. Slaters. I don't think that there are lots of, thanks Ange, there's lots of creatures that will turn up. You'll see lots of little mites. They don't necessarily harm your worms. They may be an indicator though that the conditions of the worm farm are not favorable to the worms. So some of those turn up when it's acidic. I don't know about slaters in particular. I know there's things called potworms, and I know that there's the fruit flies, the vinegar flies, and they're indicators of acidity. It's not bad, but it may just mean that depending on what they eat, they may compete with the worms for what the worms are trying to eat. So worms you want to be as your primary occupant of a worm farm. Now here's just, when I say cover it with here's another reason why I like to cover it with the carbon. You think of worms, you open your worm farm lid and they all sort of draw away and they hide. Worms like being undercover, they don't like to be exposed. And so if it's open, the worms will go deeper and stay down here where they're undercover. If you put a cover on it, they'll come up to the top and they can move all around right there. So when I pulled off, I came up to my compost this morning, I peeled back that cardboard and I could see, whoops, going the wrong way, I could see the worms, there we go, right on top. They were right up all through the veggie scraps, which is where they want to be. They weren't hiding underneath. So I always encourage putting that cover on them. All right, those are the points we kind of already said. How much to feed them there. Important that it's not overfed. I was guilty of doing this. I thought I could just keep pumping the food in and the worms would just cope. And I was finding that my worm farm was the classic acidic worm farm, and I had other creatures turning up and I had fruit flies and the worms were taken off. So I'm holding back, and that's where I use that other thermocompost instead to deal with all the extras. As I said before, rotting food's anaerobic. Yep, we've covered all those points. Let's carry on. So let's talk about some of these issues, some of which we've already kind of mentioned. This is how it should look. Wood ash, Rachel, that's a good question. Wood ash is great to put in there. Obviously, you just want to know what wood ash is from. So if it's organic matter, if you're burning, firewood, great. If it's been any other kind of treated timber or chemical timber, you wouldn't want to be putting that in there. With ash, I would just be careful how you put it in, because worms can't crawl through ash. It'll just coat them and cover them. So you'd kind of have to mix it in with some of the other stuff, or just make sure it's in a way that's not smothering it or bogging it down. But ash is really important. There's sort of the three colors we talk about, green, brown, and white. They all add different components into building that soil structure. So wood ash would come under that white category. Yep, so that's a good one. Okay, this is how your bin should look. This is what it should do, is when you open it up, it should not smell. People often say, ooh, compost, ooh. And I say, well, no, actually, if it's as it should be, it should just be a sweet, lovely, sweet smelling soil kind of plant, like forest hummus, like leaves on the forest floor, that kind of smell. It shouldn't be, ooh, yuck. There should be lots of worms visible. And the liquid at the bottom of the worm farm that's draining out should be an amber color, should be a color of a tea, and it shouldn't, again, smell. If it is really dark, or if it does smell, and if it's really pungent and like manure smelling, you might be thinking again, what am I putting in my compost? That's another indicator of things going wrong. Okay, so some of the common mistakes we said before: too much, too big, too deep, too often. But here's some of the things that people talk about. My worms are dying, or my worms are exiting, they're taking off. It's too acidic, too dry. So worms dying, first of all, it goes back to what we were just saying. Either they don't like the food, you're putting in stuff that could actually potentially kill them, like some of those molds and astringent foods and things like that. If they're exiting, it's a sign that they don't like what's going on. If you've ever opened up your worm farm, and I'm going to show you a picture in a sec, of worms all over the side, taken off, there's a couple of reasons for that. I'll tell you about that in a sec. Acidic, we've talked about. Too dry, sometimes that happens. I had a worm farm a couple of weeks ago that had ants all around it, and so I looked as to why there were ants in there, and that was indicating that it was, again, too dry. So I've just added a little bit of water to my worm farms, but they don't want it wet, they don't want it mucky. It just needs to be damp. If you're a worm and you were thinking of crawling through things, what would you like to crawl through? Can you crawl through dry stuff, crumbly stuff? No, it needs to be damp, like a wrung out sponge is kind of the texture that you're looking for. If there's no liquid fertilizer coming through, it depends on a couple of things. If it's a brand new wood farm and you've only just set it up, it can actually take months, weeks or months, for everything to saturate and that liquid to go down through all the layers and come out the bottom. That could be one reason. Or if it's too dry, again, that worm farm that was too dry that I mentioned with the ants, it was not producing any liquid fertilizer. It actually dried up. So I added a little bit of moisture just a little bit, so it went down through and I could see it dripping again. Okay, that's enough. And made sure it wasn't too wet in the top. Yeah. My worms are trying to escape. This is pretty common. Now mine were doing this morning. They were doing this all over the sides. There's a couple of reasons here. It says, first of all, the worms, you know, when it's about to rain, actually, you know, they're pretty instinctual creatures. And just before rain, they come out of the ground to avoid drowning because worms breathe through their skin. And that was interesting because we've had lots of rain these last couple of days. And that's exactly what my worms were doing. I've been adjusting the moisture, but adjusting the acidity. There really wasn't a reason for them to be exiting, but they were like this. They're all over the sides of the bin. And I just put that down to the rain. But if they are taking off, once again, check the acidity, check the moisture. Is it too much food? Is it rotting? Is there the wrong stuff in there? Those are all kind of the same things again and again that you would check. Here's some tips. How deep the food should be, adding some lime occasionally, that helps balance the acidity, avoiding large quantities of processed food. So food with chemicals in it. So that's why you're not putting biscuits and potato chips and things like that, because there's oil and there's salt and there's chemicals and flavorings. The worms aren't interested in that. So really stick to the plant-based stuff. Yeah, that's where that wants to go. Okay, how to harvest your worm tea. Now I'm just going kind of zipping through. I'm being mindful of time, but if you do have any more questions, pop them through. I hope I'm covering some of the things that you're wondering about. How to harvest worm tea. There's lots of names for this: worm wheeze, worm pea, worm tea, worm juice, worm cocktails. There's everything. It's the liquid that comes out of the bottom of your worm farm. So all worm farms, every single one, is designed so that they drain out the bottom. And it's all the work that the worms have been doing is coming out in liquid form down below. And if you don't know this, it is the magic. If you're a gardener, this is the #1 thing that you want to have for your worm, for your plants, for your garden. This is the reason why people have worm farms. Aside from dealing with food waste, and aside from building new soil, it's giving you a magic product for your garden: fertilizer, fungicide, pesticide, doing all the jobs you want for free by feeding your worms. Here's some of the things they do. Repopulates the soil with microbes and beneficial bacteria to get things going. So if you got a new garden and you've planted stuff and you put some soil in there, by pouring worm juice into it, it's just activating all that soil activity and all the microbial activity that you want to have. But it's also helping your plants uptake the nutrients, and changing the condition of the soil, changing the activity of the soil. And you can't get any of these in any synthetic fertilizer that you could buy in a shop. So this is better than anything you could buy in a shop. So yesterday we were talking about Maori food sovereignty. We've been talking about, you know, being creating closed loop systems at home and all that sort of thing. So putting the food waste in the compost builds new soil, gives you these products, grows healthy food. You eat the food, you compost it, you put it in the garden, you grow more food, you compost it, makes new soil, you compost it. Circular economy in your own backyard, and the best and the healthiest, healthy us, healthy soil, healthy everything. When you have to dilute it. You have to dilute it. It's super strong. It's not acidic, so it's not going to burn your plants. I can see your question there, Ange. Yeah, that was somebody who got Ange's asking, what are the teeth marks on the side of my hungry bin? That was back there. Yeah, I think this is an old hungry bin I inherited a while back. It looks like somebody got trapped in there. I would venture a rodent, and it was trying to chew its way out. I've never seen it in my time, but it's telling a story of, yeah, they can't get in. All worm farms are enclosed systems. Good point. That's why worm farms are all enclosed. They all have lids, because your worms are a free source of protein. And in the winter, if it's not an enclosed system, if you don't have a secure lid, the rats will get in, not just for the food scraps, but they'll have a munch out and clean out and burrow through and eat all your worm population. I've had it happen before. Thanks, Ange, for that question. What are we up to? Yeah, diluting this. So it wants to look like a strong tea. Kind of like that. I mixed this up this morning, in fact, and mine's looking really dark. I'm not sure if that's how it should look. I think that's because my worm farms were acidic and I had too much food in them. That's sort of the beginning of this whole journey of finding out this stuff during lockdown. So again, the color of the worm juice at the bottom is an indicator of what's going on up above. Ideally, it should be amber and it should be like a tea. But I do dilute it. I think I can make it stretch. I take, you know, a cup, half a cup, that much of the worm juice, and I've put it into this big black bin and I bulk it out. Now, at the very minimum, 1 to 10, 1 part worm tea, 10 parts water. Depends how strong it is, depends how big your worm farm is, depends how many worms you have working, and how colorful, how dark it looks. So mine was pretty dark, so I bulked it out quite a lot. And then I just put this on my garden. And true fact, a day after applying the liquid fertilizer to my garden, I can see the difference in my plants. Absolutely. They're just bigger, greener, fuller, taller, stronger. They're just like you've supercharged them. It's amazing. Instant feedback. So this is the best thing for your garden. Okay, how to harvest worm castings. So again, the vermicast is all about enriching the soil, and it's the best fertilizer that you're going to get. It also helps absorb and retain moisture. It's improving the soil structure, and it just has so many nutrients that are there for the plants and gradually released for their benefit. So this is the actual leftovers after the worms have munched and eaten away. It looks, you can kind of tell by the look of it, it's very, very fine, almost a powdery, fine. Well, it's basically worm poo, and it's the best possible that you can add into your soil. There's a few different ways of getting it out. People often say, how do I get the compost out without getting all the worms out? So if you have a bathtub compost, one trick is put all the food down one end, all the worms migrate down there, and then you can clean out the other end and then swap. That's one way of doing it. Another one is to take your lid off your compost, your worm farm, whatever structure you've got, or on a tarp or on a board, and just make little handfuls like that picture there, little mounds of compost with worms, because they live in that, the worms are living in that upper structure. So make little mounds, dink, 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 make little rows, mound, 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 mound. By the time you've done that, come back to the first one, flip it over, and the worms will look like that. They'll be in a little clump at the bottom. So you flip it up, pull your worms out, boink, in that bucket, compost over there. So you can put your worms back in the compost, keep them working. Here's some compost for your garden. Lots of worm farms like Hungry Ben, they have a tray that drops down, or the stacker ones, the can of worms, you've got a tray that you remove. The worms always go up to the food, and the castings and the leftovers filter down to the bottom. So most worm farms you'll see, there's a way of separating. Here's the castings, the worms are up top. How to make your own worm farm. So if this has interested you and you think, yep, I'm in, I want to have a worm farm, I want to have that liquid gold for my garden, I want to feed the soil, I want to restore papatsuanuku, I want to have healthy kai, then it's not that hard actually. Yes, you can buy, there's lots of designs out there and they cost some money, but you can also make your own. I've always pretty much made my own. The first one I made was a recycling bin, just like that one. You know, it's got a hole in the bottom, put it on a couple of blocks. I'm going to show you in a sec how to layer it up inside. You've got a worm farm, put a lid on top. But the rats chewed through that one because it was plastic. So then I went to that second one. I went to the recycling center and got an old steel laundry tub. Once again, a couple of blocks, gravel and stuff over the plug so it doesn't block, the bucket underneath, and that did have a wood lid on top. I just took it off there, that's just the mat on top. Then I went bigger. Next one along, third picture, I made a worm farm out of a bathtub. Perfect. And look at the one at the bottom. What an easy idea. If you're redoing the laundry, look at the laundry tub. The sink up above is the worm farm with the plug hole, and down below on the right you can see draining into the bucket, there's your worm juice. So you can just use what you've already got to do it. Now here's a couple of designs. So when you do it, like the bathtub, you always want to have something at the bottom, some sort of gravel covering the plug so it doesn't block with the muck, with compacting soil. You put your worms in the middle, you're bedding carbon, food on top, and you always have to have a lid. There has to be a fitted lid that mice and rats can't get through. Here's another example showing the same thing. Now I just went on Google and I just went worm farm, how to, lots of ideas. They all follow the same strategy every time. Here's one out of stackable, storage containers. And you just need to drill some holes, and there's some instructions, and you put one on top of the other, set one in, you've got the draining layer, same thing. Carbon, nitrogen, cover on top, paper, cardboard, make your own. Yeah, so there's a bunch of ideas there. Well, that's it. I haven't seen too many questions come through, so I'm hoping either that means that I have covered all the things that you've wondered about in my kōrero today. No more questions. Well, all right then. So all we have to say now then is off you go, haere atu, into the world of worm farming. It's magical, it's wonderful. It's just like any other creature on the farm. They have conditions they like, they have a habitat they like, they have food that they like. And if you look after them, and if you do those things, they'll thrive. If they're not in the conditions they'll like, they'll take off or die. It's kind of what happens. So you look after them, they give you back this amazing compost and liquid fertilizer for your garden. You keep food from food waste, from the landfill, sorry. The number one big no-no in landfill is putting compostable stuff, because it rots and it creates methane gas and leachate, which in our landfills is the number one problem. And methane gas is adding to climate change, and leachate is poisoning rivers, lakes, and soil. We don't want compostable materials in landfill. So feed it to the worms, feed your food to chooks, feed your food to pigs, feed your food to dig it into the soil, to the worms, anything. Just don't feed the landfill. That's my kōrero for today. Well, tomorrow we're going to have another Facebook Live. So come back. We've got Pine tomorrow, and he will be talking about wastewater systems and composting toilets. Another take on this, how to get nature to do the work rather than using our fresh water supplies, our waiinu and our waimaori to deal with our waste, how to get composting systems and how to get worms even perhaps to do that job. If you have any questions about any of this, today I'm in the Waikato and I'm working with everybody in the Waikato, as I said, alongside others. There's my contact details there. If you have any questions from further afield, anywhere else around the motu, there's the Parakore website down the bottom. And there's one of us just about in every corner, and we'd be very happy to help. So, ngam hinui kia koutou katoa. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are. Get out there in the garden if you can. And until next time. Any final questions? Nope. All right then. We're going to stop here. Kia ora koutou.